The young woman stood on my porch with trembling hands, clutching a faded envelope so tightly that its corners had bent into soft curves. Her eyes were swollen from crying, her dress was simple but spotless, and behind her sat an old car that looked like it had survived 1,000 lonely roads. Before she spoke another word, tears rolled down her cheeks as she whispered that her father had died 3 days earlier, and she had come to pay the debt he owed me. At that moment, I thought I was about to witness the end of an old story. Instead, I was standing at the beginning of one that would change my life forever. Before we continue, if you believe kindness always finds its way back, and that everyone deserves a second chance, please take a moment to like this video, comment where you're watching from. Share this story with someone who still believes in humanity, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us tell more stories that touch hearts around the world. I looked at the envelope in her shaking hands without reaching for it. The afternoon sun stretched long shadows across my front yard, and for several seconds neither of us spoke. There was something about her expression that reminded me of someone I hadn't seen in over 20 years. Not because she looked exactly like him, but because grief had carved the same quiet dignity into her face. Her father had once been my closest friend. His name was Daniel Carter, and long before life became complicated, we had dreamed together under the same skies. We grew up in the same neighborhood where money was always short, but laughter somehow never was. We built treehouses that collapsed every summer, skipped stones across the creek until sunset, and promised each other that one day we would build businesses side by side. For a while, it almost happened. When we reached our 30s, we opened a small construction company together. We worked harder than anyone else in town. We poured concrete before sunrise, repaired roofs through freezing winters, and celebrated every new contract like it was a miracle. We weren't getting rich, but we were building something honest. Then life did what life often does. Daniel's wife became seriously ill. Hospital bills arrived faster than our paychecks. Insurance refused to cover treatments that doctors insisted were necessary. Every month another impossible choice appeared between keeping the business alive and keeping hope alive at home. Without hesitation, I loaned Daniel every dollar I had saved. It wasn't a formal agreement between strangers. It was trust between brothers. I told him to pay me back whenever life became kinder, but life became cruel instead. His wife passed away after a long battle. Daniel changed after that. The laughter disappeared first, then the confidence. Then slowly, almost without anyone noticing, the man who had once been the strongest person I knew stopped believing in tomorrow. He insisted on selling his share of the company because he believed he had become a burden. I argued for weeks, but grief is louder than reason. Eventually, he left town with his little daughter, hoping to start over somewhere no one knew their pain. That daughter was now standing on my porch. For more than 20 years, I never heard from Daniel again. Sometimes I wondered if he was happy. Sometimes I feared the answer. Now I finally knew. She carefully held out the envelope again. She explained that after organizing her father's few belongings, she had discovered an old wooden box hidden beneath his bed. Inside were faded photographs, handwritten letters, and a notebook filled with names. Next to mine was a number, $48,000. Beside it, Daniel had written only one sentence. "The debt I must repay before I meet God." Those words struck me harder than I expected. She explained that her father never stopped talking about me. Even during his hardest years, he often told her about the friend who had sacrificed everything without asking for anything in return. He had promised himself that one day he would repay every cent. But that day never came. Instead, cancer came first. The treatments consumed what little money he managed to save. When doctors finally admitted there was nothing more they could do, Daniel asked his daughter to make him one final promise. No matter how long it took, no matter how difficult life became. She must find me. She must repay his debt. She said those words with such determination that I realized she had probably repeated them 100 times during the long drive to my house. I finally accepted the envelope. Inside were cash, money orders, and several small checks. Together, they barely totaled $5,000. She quickly apologized before I could speak. She had sold her father's pickup truck. She had emptied her savings account. She had taken extra shifts at the diner where she worked. She promised she would continue sending money every month until every dollar had been repaid. There wasn't pride in her voice. There was responsibility. The kind her father had planted inside her years earlier. Looking at that envelope, I realized something heartbreaking. She wasn't trying to pay my debt. She was trying to protect her father's honor. That mattered far more than money. I invited her inside. The house felt unusually quiet that afternoon. We sat across from each other at my kitchen table while old memories filled every empty corner of the room. She noticed framed photographs on the wall, including one taken decades ago. Two young men covered in sawdust stood beside the first house our company had ever built. One of them was me, the other was her father. She stared at the photograph for a long time before smiling through tears. She admitted she had never seen that picture before. For nearly an hour she asked questions about the version of her father she never had the chance to know. I told her everything. How he once gave away an entire paycheck to help a stranger whose home had burned down. How he spent weekends repairing elderly neighbors' fences without accepting payment. How children followed him around because he somehow made every ordinary afternoon feel like an adventure. As I spoke, I watched grief slowly transform into gratitude. She wasn't just hearing stories. She was meeting the father she thought had disappeared long before she was old enough to remember. Eventually, she confessed something that broke my heart. She believed she had failed him. Despite working 2 jobs, she couldn't afford college anymore. Bills kept piling up. The small apartment they rented would soon have to be vacated. Everything she owned fit inside that tired old car parked outside. Still, she insisted the debt came first, because promises mattered. I leaned back in my chair and quietly thought about Daniel. I imagined him writing those words in his notebook while fighting illness alone. I imagined him worrying less about dying than about leaving unfinished responsibilities behind. Some people measure wealth by what they leave their children. Daniel had left something far greater than money. He had left integrity. That cannot be inherited by accident. It must be lived. Outside, evening sunlight began filling the windows with golden light. For the first time since she arrived, she looked exhausted rather than determined. She had carried the weight of her father's final promise across hundreds of miles. Now she waited for my judgment. She expected me to count the money, to calculate what remained. Instead, I stood up and walked toward the old bookshelf near the fireplace. Hidden behind several albums sat a small metal box. Inside rested the original handwritten loan agreement. Technically, it wasn't even necessary. I had never intended to enforce it. But Daniel insisted years ago that real friendship deserved real accountability. His signature remained clear despite the faded paper. So did mine. I returned to the table. She watched silently. Carefully, I unfolded the document between us. Then I looked directly into her eyes. What happened next became the moment that would stay with both of us for the rest of our lives. Without saying a word, I slowly tore the agreement in half, then into quarters, then into tiny pieces. The paper drifted onto the table like snow, her face filled with confusion, then panic, then disbelief. She reached forward as though trying to stop me, but it was already done. I gently placed the envelope back into her hands. I told her something I had carried inside my heart for over 20 years. Her father had borrowed money, but he had already repaid me many times over. Not with dollars, with loyalty, with friendship, with sacrifices no ledger could ever measure. When my own wife was recovering from surgery years ago, Daniel worked double shifts so I could stay beside her. When my father passed away, he handled every business responsibility without asking for recognition. When my son was born prematurely, Daniel quietly paid our mortgage for 2 months because he knew I would never ask for help. Those things never appeared in accounting books, but they were debts too. And they had all been paid long ago. Tears streamed down her face as she finally understood. Her father had never been remembered as someone who owed. He had always been remembered as someone who gave. The envelope remained untouched between us. For the first time since arriving, her shoulders relaxed. The burden she carried was finally beginning to disappear, but I wasn't finished. I walked upstairs and returned carrying another envelope. This one was thicker. Inside was something far more valuable than cash. It contained the deed to a small rental house I owned across town, along with documents establishing an education fund that had been sitting untouched for years after my own son received a scholarship he never needed to use. I had been waiting for someone who truly deserved it, maybe without realizing it. Maybe destiny had simply been patient. I slid the envelope across the table. She looked at it but refused to open it. Years of struggle had taught her not to expect miracles. I smiled because her father would have reacted exactly the same way. I explained that the house would give her a place to rebuild without worrying about rent, and the education fund would allow her to return to school whenever she was ready. None of it was charity. It was simply one old friend finally finishing a promise he never realized he had made. She cried harder than she had all afternoon, not because someone had solved every problem, but because someone had reminded her that goodness survives longer than hardship. As she drove away that evening, the setting sun reflected across her windshield, and for just a moment I imagined Daniel sitting in the passenger seat, smiling quietly with the peace that had escaped him for so many years. Some debts can be counted, others can only be felt. Money can repay a loan, but compassion repays a life. Years later, people would ask me why I tore up that agreement instead of accepting what was owed. My answer never changed. A debt written on paper can disappear with a signature, but the kindness written into someone's character can echo for generations. Daniel believed he died owing me everything. The truth was exactly the opposite. His greatest payment wasn't the money he tried to return. It was the daughter he raised to honor promises even when life became unbearably difficult. The next morning, I woke before sunrise. But my mind was still occupied by the young woman who had driven away, carrying far more than an envelope. She had arrived believing she was the daughter of a man who died in debt. She left knowing she was the daughter of a man whose greatest wealth had never been money. Yet something deep inside me whispered that our story had only begun. I had spent years believing I had buried the past. Instead, the past had returned, not to reopen old wounds, but to heal them. For several days, I expected nothing. Then one quiet afternoon, my phone rang. It was her. Her voice sounded different. The fear that had filled every word when we first met had been replaced with cautious hope. She told me she had moved into the small house and had spent hours cleaning every room, opening windows that had been shut for years, and planting fresh flowers by the front porch, because her father always believed every home deserved something alive growing outside. She admitted that while unpacking the few boxes she owned, she found another notebook hidden inside one of Daniel's old jackets. Unlike the first notebook filled with bills and reminders, this one contained dreams. Every page was filled with plans he had never been able to complete. There were sketches for affordable homes he wanted to build for struggling families. There were notes about creating scholarships for children who lost parents. There were ideas about teaching young people construction skills so they could earn honest livings. Reading those pages made her realize something heartbreaking. Her father had not spent his final years thinking only about surviving. Even while battling illness, he had continued dreaming about helping strangers. She asked if she could bring the notebook to me. When she arrived that evening, we sat together on the porch instead of inside the house. The summer breeze carried the scent of fresh-cut grass, and for the first time, our conversation felt less like two strangers connected by grief and more like family rediscovering itself. As I turned each page, memories flooded back. Every idea was written in Daniel's familiar handwriting, full of optimism despite the pain he must have been carrying. Some pages even mentioned my name. One sentence stopped me cold. If I don't live long enough, maybe Michael will know what to do with these dreams. I closed the notebook and stared into the distance. I had spent years building a successful construction company. We built luxury homes, office buildings, and shopping centers. The business was profitable beyond anything Daniel and I had imagined as young men. Yet somewhere along the way, we had become so busy building structures that I had forgotten why we wanted to build in the first place. That night, I barely slept. The following Monday, I called an emergency meeting with my executive team. They expected another discussion about profits and expansion. Instead, I walked into the conference room carrying Daniel's notebook. Some of my employees had worked beside him decades earlier. Others had never heard his name. I told them his story. I told them about the friend who had sacrificed everything for the people he loved. Then I made an announcement that left the room completely silent. From that day forward, our company would dedicate part of every year's profits to building homes for widows, veterans, and single parents who had nowhere else to turn. We would create apprenticeship programs for young adults who couldn't afford college but wanted honest careers. And the entire initiative would carry one name: the Daniel Carter Foundation. Several people around the table quietly wiped away tears, not because of the financial commitment, because they realized they were witnessing the fulfillment of a promise made decades earlier between two young friends who once believed kindness mattered more than success. The foundation launched 6 months later. Our first project was a modest 3-bedroom home for a single mother raising 3 children after losing her husband in a workplace accident. When we handed her the keys, she collapsed into tears so overwhelming that none of us could speak. Standing beside me was Daniel's daughter. She had enrolled back in college, studying architecture because she wanted to finish the kind of work her father had dreamed about. Every weekend, she volunteered at construction sites, learning from the same crews who had once worked alongside Daniel himself. Watching her laugh with them felt like watching history gently repair itself. Word about the foundation spread faster than anyone expected. Former customers donated materials. Retired builders volunteered their time. Local businesses contributed supplies. Even people who had never met Daniel wanted to be part of something that reminded them goodness still existed. One afternoon, nearly a year after she first knocked on my door, we completed our 10th home. As volunteers gathered for a simple celebration, an elderly man slowly approached us using a wooden cane. His eyes never left the photograph displayed beside the stage. It was a picture of Daniel. The man introduced himself quietly. More than 25 years earlier, his family had lost everything in a fire. Insurance covered almost nothing. While everyone else offered sympathy, Daniel had appeared with a truck full of lumber and spent nearly 3 months rebuilding their home after work every evening. The elderly man's voice cracked as he admitted something none of us knew. Daniel had refused every dollar offered in payment. Instead, he simply said, "If you ever see someone hurting the way you're hurting today, help them. Then we'll be even." The old man smiled through tears. I've spent 25 years trying to keep that promise. By then, nearly everyone listening was crying. One act of kindness had become another, then another, then another. Not because anyone was keeping score, because compassion multiplies when people choose to pass it forward. Later that evening, Daniel's daughter and I stood alone outside the newest home we had built. Children were already running through the backyard, laughing as though sorrow had never existed there. She looked at me with tears in her eyes and admitted something she had carried silently since the day we met. For years, she believed her father died thinking he had failed her. Now she understood the truth. He hadn't left her money, he had left her purpose. She thanked me for giving her father back to her, not as the sick, exhausted man she remembered from his final years, but as the courageous, generous soul everyone else had known. I smiled and gently shook my head. "No," I said softly, "he gave himself back to all of us." As the sun disappeared beyond the horizon, I realized something beautiful. The debt she came to repay had never belonged to Daniel. It belonged to every person who had ever received kindness and wondered how they could possibly repay it. The answer had never been to pay it back. The answer was always to pass it on. And perhaps that is the greatest inheritance anyone can leave behind. Before this story ends, I have one heartfelt request. If Daniel's journey reminded you that kindness never truly dies, please write. I'll pass it on in the comments below. Your words may encourage someone else to become the answer to another person's prayers. Years have passed since that unforgettable knock on my door. The foundation has built dozens of homes. Hundreds of young people have learned skilled trades through our apprenticeship program. Scholarships have helped students who once believed education was impossible. And every new project begins the same way. We gather around a weathered photograph of 2 young friends standing beside the first little house they ever built together. One of them dreamed big. The other kept believing after the dreamer was gone. Together, even decades later, they are still building homes, still rebuilding lives, still proving that love, integrity, and compassion never end with the people who first create them. They continue living through every heart willing to carry them forward. If this story touched your heart, please like this video, share it with your family and friends, subscribe to the channel for more inspiring stories, and leave your thoughts in the comments. You never know whose life might change because you chose to spread one simple message of hope.